The night was supposed to be filled with joy. In a dimly lit hospital room, a father held his newborn baby for the first time, his eyes wet with pride and wonder. But that fragile peace was shattered in an instant. Flashing red and blue lights cut through the window as police stormed inside, their shouts echoing louder than the newborn's cries. What happened next was unthinkable. A single reckless decision turned a celebration into horror. What those officers didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined, was that the man they had just destroyed was no ordinary father. He was the deadliest Navy SEAL alive, and he would not forgive. The man's name was Marcus Cole, though most who knew him outside of civilian life remembered him by his call sign, Phantom. Years of covert operations had honed him into one of the most skilled and lethal men in military history. Yet here, in this small city far from the battlefield, Marcus was simply a husband, and now, at last, a father. He had spent his life doing the impossible, crawling through deserts under blistering sun, swimming through enemy-infested waters in the dead of night, dismantling terror cells before they even had the chance to strike. But nothing had tested him quite like the road to this moment, sitting beside his wife Elena, holding their child in the soft glow of hospital light. For Marcus, the world outside those walls, the medals, scars, secrets, suddenly felt meaningless. The couple had endured a lifetime of hardship to reach this point. Elena had been his anchor through the chaos of war, writing letters when deployment stretched into endless months, waiting through countless missions when Marcus disappeared into classified shadows. When he finally retired, trading the battlefield for civilian life, they dreamed of starting fresh. A family, a new chapter, but the city they lived in was fractured. Tension simmered in the streets, where wealth and privilege stood in stark contrast to systemic neglect and prejudice. Marcus had felt the subtle weight of it many times, a suspicious glance when he entered a bank in casual clothes, the way store clerks followed him with their eyes, or how police cruisers lingered whenever he drove through certain neighborhoods. Elena noticed it too, but she always told him, "You're free now. This is our chance to live quietly." Marcus wanted to believe her. The day his child was born felt like proof of that promise. Elena's cries of pain gave way to joy as their baby entered the world, small and fragile, but alive, with tiny fists curling as though ready to fight fate itself. Marcus had stared down insurgents, faced ambushes, and survived firefights where the odds were zero, but this tiny life in his arms left him trembling. "Welcome to the world," he whispered, rocking the child gently. "Daddy's got you. Nobody will ever hurt you." But destiny, it seemed, had other plans. Outside the hospital, a different storm was brewing. A local convenience store had been robbed an hour earlier. The suspect description was vague. A black man, tall, wearing a hoodie. It was the kind of lazy profile that had spelled danger for countless innocent men before. Fueled by adrenaline and poor judgment, a group of officers followed a lead to the hospital, convinced the suspect had slipped inside to hide. Marcus was unaware of the chaos unfolding beyond the sterile walls of the maternity ward. He had placed his phone on silent, wanting nothing to intrude on these first sacred moments. Elena was resting, exhausted, as Marcus stood by the window with his child, marveling at the tiny heartbeat pressed against his chest. The first sign of danger came with the echo of boots pounding down the hall. Then the blinding glare of flashlights cut through the doorway. "Hands where we can see them." Marcus turned, shielding the baby instinctively. His training snapped into place instantly. Fast calculations, identifying exit points, assessing threat levels. But this wasn't a battlefield. He wasn't holding a rifle. He was holding his newborn child. "What are you doing?" he asked, voice steady but sharp. "This is a maternity room." The officers didn't care. Their eyes weren't on the delicate hospital bed, or the resting mother, or the child barely minutes old. They saw only a target, a black man standing tall, refusing to look afraid. "Drop the baby." "Hands up!" one officer barked. Marcus's chest burned with fury. "Drop the baby?" The words made no sense. He shifted, cradling his child closer, his instincts screaming at him to protect. Everything that happened next blurred into chaos. A sudden lunge, a misunderstanding, a gun raised too quickly, a single trigger pull that shattered the room like glass. The baby's cry was cut short. The world tilted. Elena's scream tore through the air. Marcus froze, staring down at the silence in his arms, at the life stolen before it had begun. He had seen comrades die. He had buried brothers in arms. But nothing had ever gutted him like this. The officers stumbled back, muttering excuses, fumbling for justifications that sounded hollow even to themselves. "We thought he reached," but their words didn't matter. Not anymore. Marcus wasn't Phantom in that moment. He wasn't a soldier or a hero or a strategist. He was a father who had just lost everything. The room seemed to hold its breath. The officers didn't know who they had just crossed. They didn't know that the man, standing in the shadows of that hospital, was one of the most lethal operatives the U.S. military had ever produced. But they would, because Marcus Cole had only one mission left in his life now, and it would be carried out with a precision, ruthlessness, and resolve that no enemy had ever survived. That was the night the city unknowingly awoke the deadliest Navy SEAL alive. The hospital room was chaos, but Marcus heard none of it. His ears roared with the kind of silence only soldiers knew, that terrible ringing that followed an explosion, the body's way of protecting itself from trauma too great to process. He stood frozen, staring down at the stillness in his arms. His child, gone. Elena's sobs filled the room, raw and breaking. Nurses rushed in, horrified, their hands trembling as they tried to intervene, to resuscitate what could not be revived. Marcus's gaze never left the tiny body. He had promised to protect this life with his own, and in the space of a gunshot, that promise had been shattered. The officers muttered excuses, voices sharp and defensive. He made a move. It was instinct. He looked dangerous. Each word only deepened the wound, stripping away the humanity of the child who lay lifeless in Marcus's arms. The hospital staff whispered too, though in different tones, fear, outrage, disbelief. But nobody stepped forward. Nobody confronted the officers. The weight of power kept everyone still. Marcus laid the baby gently in Elena's arms, his face unreadable. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. He didn't even respond to the officers still fumbling for justification. Instead, he stood tall, his shoulders straightening in a way they hadn't since deployment. A quiet calm settled over him, the kind of calm that came before storms. The officers mistook that silence for defeat. They exchanged glances, half relieved. One muttered, "We'll file the report. Internal Affairs will handle it." Another added, "Don't make this harder on yourself." Harder, Marcus thought. Harder doesn't begin to cover it. As they left the room, Elena reached for him, her face pale with shock. "Marcus," her voice cracked, barely a whisper, but Marcus kissed her forehead, his eyes steady in a way that unsettled even her. "I'll take care of this," he murmured, and then he walked out. Marcus didn't go home. He disappeared into the night, his footsteps carrying him to a place few knew he kept. A storage unit on the edge of town, forgotten and ordinary to the untrained eye. Inside, beneath tarps and crates, lay the fragments of a life he thought he'd left behind, weapons stripped clean and oiled. Tactical gear packed tight, maps folded into neat squares, and a black duffel bag marked only with his call sign, Phantom. He hadn't touched any of it since retiring. He had promised Elena he would never need it again, but that promise had died alongside his child. Marcus sat in the dim glow of the storage unit, methodically preparing. The ritual was familiar, muscle memory guiding each motion, the assembling of a rifle, the careful sharpening of a blade, the precise folding of camouflage. With each click of a magazine, with each strap tightened across his chest, the man who had tried to live as a father, a husband, a civilian, vanished. What remained was Phantom. Meanwhile, the city buzzed with chatter. News outlets reported the incident in vague terms. A police confrontation gone wrong, a suspect misidentified, tragic but unavoidable. No mention of the baby, no mention of the reckless escalation. Just the familiar shield of language that stripped accountability and painted Marcus as dangerous. The officers involved were placed on temporary leave. They gave statements rehearsed with legal precision, leaning on the narrative of fear. We thought he was armed. We acted to protect the public, but the public wasn't buying it. Whispers spread through neighborhoods, outrage swelling. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Fathers shook their heads in disbelief. Activists rallied, demanding justice, their voices rising in protest. But Marcus wasn't interested in protests or court hearings. He had lived long enough to know how those stories ended, with silence, with settlements, with no real justice at all. Justice, Marcus decided, would have to come another way. His first step wasn't violence. It was information. He tailed the officers quietly, a shadow in the city they thought they controlled. He memorized their routines, the coffee shop stops, the late-night bar visits, the moments they let their guard down. Phantom wasn't reckless. He never struck blindly. Every move had to be calculated, precise. He also dug deeper, leveraging skills from years of intelligence work. He hacked into databases, pulled confidential files, and pieced together a web of corruption that stretched far beyond the officers who pulled the trigger. They weren't just bad apples. They were part of a system designed to protect itself at all costs. Cover-ups, falsified reports, buried misconduct cases. The rot went deeper than he'd imagined. Each discovery was fuel to the fire burning inside him. But Marcus knew the value of patience. Revenge wasn't just about taking lives. It was about dismantling power, about exposing truth. He wanted them humiliated before they were destroyed. He wanted the city to see their monsters for what they really were. The rising tension showed in the officers themselves. At first, they brushed off the incident, confident the department would shield them as always. But soon they noticed odd things. A patrol car's tire slashed, personal mail missing. A shadow in the alleyway that vanished when confronted. One officer came home to find his living room rearranged. Nothing stolen. But everything moved just slightly, enough to remind him that someone had been inside. Another discovered a photo on his windshield. Himself, asleep in bed, taken from just feet away. Fear crept into their lives, eroding their arrogance. They stopped laughing so loudly at bars. They double-checked locks. They jumped at shadows. Marcus was dismantling them psychologically before ever lifting a weapon, but Elena noticed his absence. Her grief had hollowed her. Yet she still recognized the danger in his eyes when he returned home, late at night, silent and distant. "You're not the same," she whispered one evening. Staring at him across the kitchen table, Marcus didn't respond. He couldn't. How could he explain that the man she loved, the father of her child, was already gone? That phantom had taken his place, driven by a mission no marriage could withstand. Elena wept, realizing she might lose him too. But Marcus kissed her forehead once more, the same way he had in the hospital. It was his silent promise. This wasn't over. The city began to notice the pattern. Anonymous leaks appeared online, body cam footage that contradicted official reports, hidden documents exposing misconduct, recordings of private conversations that revealed the officers' casual cruelty. Nobody knew where the leaks came from, but Marcus did. He was pulling strings in the shadows, dragging the truth into the light piece by piece. Public outrage boiled over. Protests grew into mass movements, demanding the officers be held accountable. Politicians scrambled, police chiefs stumbled through press conferences, and the officers themselves were forced into hiding. Yet still, Marcus wasn't satisfied. Exposure wasn't enough. Not for his child. The time for shadows was ending. The time for confrontation was near. One night, Marcus stood on a rooftop overlooking the city. The wind tugged at his jacket, the lights below flickering like a battlefield seen from afar. He thought of the child he never got to raise, the future stolen in a flash. He thought of Elena, broken and grieving, and he thought of the men who had done this, who still breathed freely, who still believed they would escape true justice. Not for long. Phantom had a plan. And when the storm came, it would not pass quietly. The city was restless. Weeks of protests had grown louder, angrier, impossible to ignore. Police lines clashed with crowds almost nightly, the air thick with smoke and chants. And through it all, whispers spread of a ghost stalking the guilty, a shadow that knew their secrets. that dismantled their sense of safety piece by piece. But Marcus, Phantom, knew whispers alone weren't enough. He hadn't come this far to let them hide behind lawyers and press releases. He needed the world to see. He needed them unmasked. The opportunity came on a humid evening when the City Hall announced a televised press conference. The police chief, flanked by city officials, promised to set the record straight. Reporters flooded the atrium, cameras flashing, microphones raised, waiting for carefully rehearsed statements. Among the crowd of journalists, unseen, moved Marcus. His baseball cap was low, his stance casual, but his eyes tracked every detail. He wasn't here to blend in. He was here to strike. The officers responsible were brought out, standing stiffly behind the podium. Their uniforms gleamed, polished for the cameras, as though shining brass could erase blood. One spoke into the microphone, his tone dripping with contrition practiced in front of a mirror. It was a tragic misunderstanding. Our hearts go out to the family. We acted in fear, under pressure. Mistakes were made, but... The crowd murmured, reporters scribbling, but Marcus wasn't listening. His focus was on the small black device in his pocket. A remote. The moment the officer paused to sip water, Marcus pressed the button. The massive screen behind the stage flickered, cutting off the official feed. Gasps rippled through the atrium as the projector lit up with shaky body cam footage, not the sanitized version the department had released. The real footage. The audience watched in stunned silence as the truth played out, and unarmed Marcus holding his newborn, pleading, his voice calm, measured. The baby's soft cry. The sudden, unjustifiable gunshot. Elena's scream. The officers' panicked voices scrambling to invent lies. The atrium erupted. Shouts, gasps, curses filled the air. Reporters surged forward, cameras snapping furiously. The officers on stage froze, their faces draining of color as their carefully built wall of deception crumbled live on broadcast. The police chief barked orders, scrambling to cut the feed, but Marcus had locked it down. More files played. Audio recordings of officers laughing at past abuses. Documents proving misconduct buried. Internal memos plotting cover-ups. The truth was undeniable. Inescapable. Then Marcus stepped forward. He didn't storm the stage or wave a weapon. He simply walked, slow and deliberate, through the chaos. People instinctively moved aside. They didn't know who he was, but something in his presence, something cold, resolute, unshakable, commanded space. When he reached the front, the officers finally recognized him. One stammered, "It's him!" His voice cracked. Stripped of bravado, Marcus's eyes locked on theirs. And for the first time since that night in the hospital, he spoke loudly, his voice echoing through the atrium. "You killed my child." The words hung heavy, undeniable. "You lied. You called him a threat. A newborn, and you thought the world would never know." Gasps filled the room. Cameras zoomed in. The officer's shame was now permanent, immortalized in footage that would be replayed across every news channel, every platform, every corner of the internet. The officers tried to protest, to mumble excuses, but Marcus cut them down with a single look. "You wore the badge of protectors, but you are cowards hiding behind it. You thought you could bury the truth, but I was trained for war, and I do not lose battles." His voice didn't tremble. It was ice, controlled, lethal. Security rushed toward him, but Marcus didn't resist. He raised his hands, not in surrender, but in declaration. "You can arrest me," he said, eyes still locked on the officers. "You can silence me. But the truth is already out. The world has seen who you are, and you will never escape it." The atrium thundered with chants from protesters who had burst through barricades outside. "Justice! Justice! Justice!" The officers looked around, their power evaporating before their eyes. No longer symbols of authority, they were criminals exposed, their reputations shattered beyond repair. And Marcus? He had done what he set out to do, not by brute force but by precision, strategy, and the unrelenting will of a soldier who refused to let his child's death be erased. As he was escorted out, cameras still flashing, reporters shouting questions, Marcus felt Elena's face in his mind. Her grief, her fear of losing him too. He hadn't avenged their child with bullets. He had done it with truth. stripping the killers of their shield and leaving them naked before the world. It wasn't the kind of justice courts handed out. It was the kind of justice only Phantom could deliver, the echo of that night at City Hall carried far beyond the atrium walls. Within hours, the footage Marcus had forced onto the world was replayed across every news channel, dissected by analysts, and uploaded onto social platforms where it spread like wildfire. Millions watched, millions judged, and millions demanded change. The officers' names trended globally. Their faces, once shielded by badges and authority, now symbolized corruption, cowardice, and cruelty. No carefully crafted press release or spin from the department could undo what people had seen with their own eyes. The city, the nation, and even parts of the world were united in outrage. Yet Marcus, the man who had exposed them, was nowhere to be found. After his deliberate arrest, after those chilling final words, "The truth is already out," he seemed to vanish. The police wanted him prosecuted, calling him a domestic threat, but they underestimated the power of collective voice. Protesters filled the streets, demanding not his punishment but his freedom. Veteran groups came forward, revealing his decorated past, painting him not as a criminal, but as a patriot betrayed by the very country he served. Elena, though grieving, became his fiercest advocate. Standing before cameras, her voice trembling but unbroken, she told their story. She spoke of the night her child was taken, of the silence that followed, of the bravery it took for Marcus to expose the truth. And though her words were drenched in pain, they were also filled with conviction. "My husband fought for this nation," she said, "but in our darkest hour, the people sworn to protect us became the danger. We lost our child. But if Marcus hadn't acted, how many more families would face the same nightmare? He didn't destroy trust. He revealed the betrayal already festering within it. Her testimony went viral. Public sympathy only grew. Meanwhile, the officers responsible faced a fate they never imagined. Internal investigations, now forced into the light, uncovered years of misconduct, complaints buried, cases tampered with, disciplinary files conveniently erased. Courts could no longer ignore what millions demanded: justice. One by one, indictments were handed down. Careers ended. Reputations shattered. Some officers fled into hiding, unable to withstand the fury of a public that once applauded their badges. Others broke down under questioning, confessing to cover-ups in exchange for leniency. For the first time in years, accountability seemed within reach. And Marcus? Behind bars, awaiting trial for hacking and exposure of classified evidence, he sat in silence. But he wasn't broken. Each day, letters poured in, support from strangers, messages of gratitude from grieving families, and handwritten notes from veterans who saw in him the courage they once carried. Even the guards treated him differently. They knew who he was, what he had lost. Some saluted him quietly, away from the eyes of superiors, acknowledging a respect deeper than orders. When the trial began, the courtroom was packed. Journalists filled every seat, protesters lined the streets outside, and cameras broadcast every moment live. The prosecution painted him as a rogue vigilante, but his defense was simple. He hadn't stolen justice. He had revealed it. His lawyer reminded the jury, "Without Marcus, none of us would know the truth." He didn't commit a crime. He committed an act of courage. When Marcus finally took the stand, he didn't rant or rage. He spoke with the calm intensity of a soldier. "I served this country to protect the innocent. When my own child was killed, I was told to stay silent. I couldn't, because silence is complicity, and I will never be complicit in lies." His words rippled across the room, across every television tuned in. The verdict came after hours of deliberation. On charges of exposing classified material, guilty. On charges of endangering public order, guilty. But on charges of hacking, theft, and intent to harm, not guilty. The sentence was reduced, almost symbolic. A year with credit for time served. It wasn't total freedom, but it wasn't destruction either. The moment the judge read the sentence, the courtroom erupted, not in anger, but in applause. For once, the system had bent toward fairness, however imperfectly. When Marcus finally walked free, Elena was waiting. Her arms trembled as she embraced him, their shared grief heavy, but no longer suffocating. They had lost their child, yes, but together they had sparked something larger. Their tragedy had become a catalyst. Across the country, conversations about police reform deepened. Laws were introduced demanding transparency in body cam footage. Whistleblowers stepped forward, inspired by Marcus's defiance. Families of other victims gained renewed hope that their stories, too, might finally be heard. And though Marcus rarely spoke in public after that day, when he did, his words carried weight. He reminded people that justice wasn't a destination. It was a battle fought daily, often by ordinary people who refused to stay silent. Years later, the baby's name, engraved on a small memorial stone in a quiet park, became a symbol. Visitors left flowers, handwritten notes, even military challenge coins from veterans who saw in that child's memory the cost of complacency. Marcus and Elena visited often. They didn't need cameras or reporters. They didn't need recognition. They came in silence, holding hands, finding peace in the legacy their child left behind. Because though their baby's life was stolen, the truth Marcus unleashed ensured it was not forgotten. In the end, the world did not remember the officers' names. Their power, their lies, their desperate attempts at control, all dissolved into disgrace. But they remembered Marcus, not just as a Navy SEAL, not just as a grieving father, but as a man who refused to let silence bury the truth, and in that defiance, he turned personal tragedy into a movement that reached far beyond his own pain.